Friends, as we journey in this liturgical season, we are with you in prayer, especially in these times with COVID 19. On this 25th Sunday in Ordinary Time, God speaks to us about His own attribute, which is the generosity. Once there was a man who lived a good life and went to heaven, and Saint Peter welcomed him into heaven and started giving him a tour of heaven. And he was showing him around. This is where you have the room, that's where you have the gym, this is where you have this. Suddenly, he noticed a guy driving a very latest Mercedes Benz. And he happened to notice that it was his neighbor who used to live with him while he was on the earth. And this guy tells Peter, Peter, look, this guy is driving a Mercedes, latest one in heaven. Peter tells him, it all depends on what you do down there on the earth. If you do great works, you'll have a greater transportation. Then after showing him around, Peter finally tells this man, so here's your key, and shows him Honda CRV. And he says, what? My neighbor gets a Mercedes and I get a Honda? I told you, bro. It is what you do down there will pay you up here in heaven. Anyway, he took the key and he started driving around. A couple of days later, Peter sees this man who got a Honda CRV and he asks him, hey, how are you doing? How is your Honda CRV doing? Are you happy with it? He said, I'm very happy with it. He said, why? You complained on the first day. And this guy right away said, I'm happy with it because I saw my pastor on a skateboard in heaven. Dear brothers and sisters, as funny as it may sound, we will be paid as per the works we do on the earth. How generous we are, especially with what God gives us. So this Sunday, the lesson is on the virtue of generosity. God's generosity supersedes payrolls, paychecks, timesheets, and clock in and out. We often hear people say, that's not fair, that's not fair. We always talk in terms of human retributive justice, don't we? We would have a better world perhaps if we embrace God's ways. In the first reading, human justice, retributive justice, is shown in contrast to God's magnanimous generosity. Nowadays with COVID, when people lost their jobs and trying to find a job and find a living, it often makes sense to us. Imagine a time when you are not paid on time. Paychecks, payrolls, time-ins, clocks, all these are part of our life. We get paid for what we do. First reading, Isaiah reminds the Israel that God is more generous and forgiving. Chapters 40 to 55 in the entire prophetic literature of Isaiah talk about the post-exile times when Israelites were kind of blessed with abundance. They were out of Babylonian exile. God promised them material benefits and spiritual relief. And Isaiah tells one straight lesson to the Israelites. God does not think in the way we do. Our human standards of justice are not anywhere in close proximity to God's generosity. Notice the text from the first reading. My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. The world will be a better place if we only embrace God's ways. In the second reading, Paul, writing to Philippians, he writes this letter to Philippians from prison. Paul, as we know, was a latecomer in God's vineyard. He came and claimed himself as an apostle of Christ. Now, we need to understand little history behind the community at Philippi. Philippi was a very privileged community in Macedonia. So Paul was writing to them from the prison. Although geographically far away from Rome, Philippi, they were given the status of a Roman city. No taxes, they dressed like Romans, so they enjoyed the privilege of all Roman cities, though geographically very distant from Rome. Paul tells them, once you become followers of Rome, their ways are not consistent with heaven. So he sees a problem. while they are super abundantly blessed, Paul tells the community of Philippi, you may have citizenship of Rome, but you cannot make your standards of life just as per the standards of Rome, because your citizenship is of heaven. Not anymore Roman ways, but the standards of the gospel. Step up, not just thinking in human standards of retributive justice, but God's standards of generosity and mercy. And he says, put on the mind of Christ. That's the key. We can only become generous when we put on the mind of Christ. And he says, conduct yourselves in a way worthy of the gospel. If every Christian, every Catholic on the planet now take these words seriously, what is that? Conduct myself in a way worthy of the gospel. Our life will be so very different. Conduct ourselves in a way worthy of the gospel. In the gospel reading, the parable of good and generous employer. God is seen like a generous employer. Nowadays, we talk about human resources. For all the companies and employers invest a lot more time and energy into human resources because they want to make sure that their employees are paid on time and well. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, you name them, everyone is an employer trying to cater to their employees. But in gospel today, God is presented as a generous employer. Standards of retributive justice are shown in contrast to God's generosity. This is stunning to the human mind. How can somebody work from 8 to 5 and get paid so less, in contrast to the guy who worked only an hour and gets paid more? This is totally stunning, totally illogical to the human standards of justice. And this parable is also found only in Matthew. Now, what is God doing in this parable? The fact that the vineyard owner goes at several times during the day to look for laborers for his vineyard, what is it telling us? God is in search of his people, goes looking at various times and various city squares and markets. God is coming after you and me, looking for you and me at various times because he wants to be generous with us. He wants to give us a job. He wants to live a decent life. Now, with COVID circumstances, imagine how many people lost their jobs. Your neighbor with kids, no jobs, no paycheck, small businesses closed. Who can be generous? We can't just treat people in terms of payroll, paychecks, time in, clock in and out. We have to embrace the way of the gospel. Put on the mind of Christ. Not conduct ourselves anymore with the standards of the world, but the standards of Christ. Why this type of recruiting in the gospel at various times? The grapes in the ancient Near East were ripened by September. If they are not harvested sooner, October rains will come and destroy the entire crop. So the employer goes so many times so that his crop is not damaged. We need to embrace God's perspective, God's standards. Sometimes perhaps we do this. We begin to tell God, hey God, this is how you should be, God. Like the laborers who complain to the master, hey, these guys came in the last 1 hour, why are you giving them so much? Instead of complaining, do we rejoice when my neighbor receives more? Maybe he needs more, right? Maybe he's in a greater need than you and me. Why don't we rejoice if God is generous with them? Instead, we complain, hey God, you can't do this. You can't be unjust. Are we able to rejoice when others receive more? If God were to treat us as per the standards of justice, get this. None of us would get anything because none of us are ever worthy to receive anything from God. Church and God and the priests are to be the vehicles of God's generosity. That's not fair. That's not fair is our litany all the time. Instead, we will say, wow, it's being generous. It's stepping up. It's being merciful. And God does not treat us fairly. He treats us with grace. He gives us grace freely, gratuitously, generously. And what is grace? It is called undeserved love. Undeserved love. Paychecks, payrolls, time in, clock in and out are being fair. But God is not just fair. God is generous. He is giving us the grace. In these times with COVID-19, my Christian Catholic faith is challenged more than ever. Am I able to step up, embrace the standards of the gospel, put on the mind of Christ, and rejoice with others when they receive more from God? Or do I just think in human standards of retributive justice and prevent God's mercy and generosity not being reached to others? I think it's a profound question that you and I need to ask ourselves and reflect upon. Do we tell God how to be God? Let's be generous. Let's put on the mind of Christ. Conduct ourselves in a way worthy of the gospel. God's generosity and mercy will prevail. We are with you in prayer, joining you. Please let us know if you need any prayer requests and intentions. Please visit us, follow us on Facebook, watch us on YouTube, and please join our flock note. Father Praveen Lakkisetti here at Our Lady of Grace Catholic Church, Our Lady of Sorrows Catholic Church, St. Peter Prince of the Apostles, San Antonio, Texas. Thank you. God bless.